Well, to me they're not. I think that they are related, because I think that we can understand a whole lot more about witch hunting when we use Darwinian theory. And in this talk I will tell you why. And I will do so in 3 steps. First, I will introduce what the witch hunts were. Then I will discuss how historians, but also other scientists, have tried to explain them, and also why these explanations didn't work. And then I will propose a new Darwinian explanation that I think will work to explain witch hunting. But maybe it's good to add that I'm also sort of the only historian who believes this. Okay, so there we go. What were witch hunts? Witch hunts were persecutions of people who were considered to be witches, and they took place in Europe roughly between 1450 and 1750, and somewhere around 60,000 people were killed, predominantly 75% women. And what makes witch hunts very fascinating is that we now know that there are actually no witches. Witches don't exist, so the victims were innocent. And that, of course, makes it very intriguing, because why were people doing it? Why did they hunt for imaginary demons? And to explain this, I think it is first important to have a little understanding of the mental world of Europeans around the time that witch hunting appeared. And because witch hunts were very much inspired by fear, I will introduce you to this mental world by mentioning a few of the greatest fears of Europeans at the time. And the first fear that I will mention is the devil, also known as Satan, or the Prince of Darkness, or the Evil One. And he was God's great adversary, and he was always less powerful than God, but still able and also permanently willing to cause great harm. So people were terribly afraid of him. A second very serious, grave danger was women. And their sexuality in particular. At least this is what men often believe. Because men often thought that women had an insatiable sexual appetite. And that was a problem because sexuality was considered to be a sinful force that could easily disrupt the whole fabric of society. And what made female sexuality particularly risky was that it gave women a means to exert power over man, as you can see in this picture. And also, people were afraid of anti-Christian communities. People were really afraid of communities that were supposed to undermine the general Christian order, such as heretics and Jews. And it was in secretive gatherings, such as the Jewish Sabbath, that people feared in particular. And Europeans also had quite a common recipe for how to deal with such communities, and that was to kill them off. Then there were more universal fears of pre-modern societies, such as the fear of harmful magic, the fear of neighbors, and by that I mean general distrust within communities, or the fear of failed harvests, infertility, or the death of children. But these fears as such did not yet create witch hunts. What created the possibility of witch hunting was that these fears that had often existed independently from each other very gradually, step by step, came together into one cluster of beliefs that the historian Brian Levesque has described as the commutative concept of witchcraft. And this concept formed the basis of witch hunting, and it included the following elements. It included the idea that the devil made a pact with people, women in particular, through sex. And the devil did so by appearing as a very handsome man, and he seduced women to have intercourse with him. And it was always possible for women to recognize that something was not okay, because the devil could never be perfect. So for instance, he had the foot of a goat, he smelled of sulfur, and he was always cold. But because of this insatiable sexual appetite, very often women did not pay careful attention and did not realize who they were actually dealing with. So it was only during intercourse that they started wondering, like, why does this person have the foot of a goat? And why this sulfur smell? And why is he cold? And the devil's penis was even cold as ice. So during intercourse, that was also unlikely to escape women's attention. But at that point, it was already too late, because they were already possessed by the devil, and they had already become a witch. And the concept also included the idea that the devil formed anti-Christian communities with his witches, and they did very offensive things like destroying the cross or spitting on the Bible. And also, the devil gave his witches magical powers to cause great harm, such as failed harvests, infertility, or the death of children. So this means that witches were extremely dangerous. And what was also very frightening was that potentially anyone could be a witch. So from the outside, it was very difficult to recognize who the witches were. So there was reason to distrust anyone, including your neighbors. So what we see is that existing and already quite terrible fears had come together into one concept that was even far more frightening. But that was not yet all. The concept of witchcraft still contained a few additional elements that would give the witch hunts their very persistent character. And a very important one was the belief in a so-called witches' Sabbath. Witches were supposed to meet each other at nightly secretive gatherings where they received their instructions from the devil. As you can see in this picture, the witches' Sabbath was also visited by many demons, and they had sexual relationships with witches. And the witch in the middle on the right, she is cooking children, because witches were also cannibals, and children was their favorite dish. And the goat in the middle is the devil. And I don't know how good your eyes are, but the witch just behind him, she is actually licking his anus. Because that was a standard ritual at the witches' Sabbath. At least if the devil appeared as a goat. Because the devil could also appear as a very large toad, and then the witches would kiss his lips. But no matter how the devil appeared, witches always immediately recognized him as their master, and they surrounded him dancing ecstatically while music was performed on instruments such as human skulls and bones. So it was all very spooky. But this belief was important because it implied that witches could know and identify each other, and they'll later explain why that was important. Also, people believed that witches could fly to the witches' Sabbath, for instance, on an enchanted broomstick. And this may seem trivial, but it wasn't, because in a world without cars, bikes, or street lighting, it wasn't very easy to get very far in a single night without such a tool for flight. So because of this belief, people believed that witches could know other witches who lived far away, and will also explain why that was important. And lastly, people thought that the use of torture was a good way to find out who the witches were. Actually, there were quite strict regulations against the use of torture, but witchcraft had gradually become known as a crimen acceptum, a crime that was so very terrible that the use of torture became acceptable. So these beliefs, in combination, could have the effect that if people believed to have found one witch, they would start torturing this person in order to make him or her confess who else had visited the witches' Sabbath. And under torture, of course, very often people were willing to mention names. And then these people were tortured, and they also mentioned names. And so you could get a whole chain of accusations that could also spread over very long distances because of the belief in nightly flight. And to see how a witch hunt could work, we can move to the German city of Bamberg in the year 1626. Things seemed to be quite okay in Bamberg that year. But in May, due to very serious frost, the harvest failed. And people immediately thought that that was very strange, that kind of weather at that time of the year. So rumors about witchcraft started to spread. And at some point, a presumed witch was found in the countryside, and she was tortured, and she started mentioning names. And then these people were tortured. They also mentioned names. First only names from the countryside, but then also names from the city started to appear. And at a certain point, people in Bamberg just completely started to panic, because they thought that the danger of witchcraft was even far worse than they had already expected. So they started a massive hunt to get rid of the danger. And very soon, nobody in Bamberg was safe anymore, because a chain of accusations got started that eventually killed hundreds of people, even people from the highest elite, such as one of the mayors. And city life in Bamberg was totally disrupted for quite a while. So this is how a witch hunt could work. Okay, now we can move to the second part. How have historians, and also other scientists, try to explain this. It was in the 18th century, the time of the Enlightenment, that it gradually became clear that witches actually didn't exist. So it was also around that time that people started wondering, well, if witches don't exist, then why did our ancestors hunt them? And the most common answer around that time was, well, they did so because they were just stupid. Witch hunting became the ultimate symbol of irrational stupidity. The Spanish painter Goya, for instance, made this picture, and he called it, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." So what he means to say is, if people don't think rationally, they start believing all sorts of crazy stuff, and then you get terrible things like witch hunts. But many later scientists, certainly in the 20th century, did not find this sort of explanation convincing, because as they pointed out, the beliefs about witches and the workings of the witch hunts do not appear to have been that stupid at all. As for instance, the famous anthropologist Marvin Harris said, it was too well designed. He believed that the concept of witchcraft was too enduring and too stubborn not to have been inspired by a shrewd hidden agenda. He believed there were practical uses apart from the stated goals of the witch hunters. And Harris was not the only one to develop thoughts in this direction, because many historians have been looking for the beneficiaries of the witch hunts. So for instance, it has been argued that it was a means of the rich versus the poor, or a means of Catholics versus Protestants and vice versa, or a means of men to oppress women. So these historians believe that it was a means intelligently used to an end. And some historians who looked for inspiration from anthropology proposed a more abstract beneficiary, because they said that witch hunting was a form of scapegoating that brought mutual tensions within the community to rest. So it was society as such that benefited. Because this is what many anthropologists had said about non-Western witch beliefs. So a lot of explanations came along. But what all these explanations share is that historians nowadays reject them. And I think they are right to do so, because all these explanations have two very serious problems. And the first problem is that historic sources do not demonstrate any hidden agenda. So if we look at historical documents, what we find is people telling each other how terribly dangerous witchcraft could be and how to stop it. So it seems that they were genuinely afraid. And what they don't talk about is oppressing women, the poor, or relaxing the social system. So that makes it very hard to grasp how people could have developed such a shrewd hidden agenda if they never discussed this with each other. Another problem is that the course of the witch hunts does not demonstrate any hidden agenda either. Because if there had been a systematic agenda, what we should expect is systematic hunts. But this is not at all what we find, because witch hunts were very erratic, and it was also quite random who became the victims. So men from the elite, like the mayor and Bamba, could also become victims. And neither do we find any functional effects for society, because entire communities could be disrupted. Witch hunts didn't so much release tensions, they created tensions. And in extreme cases, almost entire villages were wiped out. So that makes it hard to see how it was functional for the social system if there was almost no social system left. So witch hunts were dysfunctional to everyone. They were not a means to an end. And these problems, or these arguments, have brought historians to the following conclusions, which is a favorite among historians. And that is that no theory works. This basically is the theory that most historians have about history. Because they often say history is always too complex, it's too messy, there are always too many exceptions for any general theory to work, so don't even try, please, don't even try. But I think this is too easy, and I think we should still give it a try, certainly because the conclusions from historians have revealed two very intriguing questions about the witch hunts. Because the first question that I have is, if witch hunts were not the product of a shrewd hidden agenda, then who or what created the concept of witchcraft? Because even if there was no hidden agenda, we may still notice that this concept was extremely well adapted to its sociocultural environment. Think of the ways in which different fears were ingeniously arranged into one and even far more frightening concept. Or think of the additional elements such as the witch's Sabbath, nightly flight, torture as a means of interrogation. It all seems to be brilliantly designed to make and keep people hunting for witches. In a way, Martin Harris was right. It was too well designed. But by whom? A second question that I have is, how is it possible that witch hunts survived for so long, despite the fact that nobody substantially benefited from them? That is very strange and demands an explanation. So what we see is a form of sociocultural design, apparently without designers, that did not substantially benefit anyone. Could there be a theory to help us out? I think there is. Darwinian evolution. I suppose you've all learned about Darwin's theory at school, but I'll just remind you of the basic idea. What the theory tries to explain is the evolution of adaptations, such as the long-necked giraffe that is so well adapted to high trees on the savannah, its environment. And what the theory says is that adaptations, such as this one, may look as if they were intelligently designed, but actually they were not designed at all. What happened in the evolutionary history of giraffes was that giraffes had all sorts of necks, just random variation in neck types. But only few giraffes survived, and it was not at random which ones survived, because the giraffes that accidentally had longer necks had better chances of survival because they ate more leaves. And together with these giraffes, longer necks also survived because they were preserved and transmitted to the next generation. So basically what the theory says is that if accidentally adapted variants, just chance hits, are cumulatively preserved, this leads to the evolution of design without design. Okay, so this is biology. Now back to history, because how am I going to relate it? There is an upcoming idea, and for instance Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett say this, that a similar process takes place in the evolution of ideas. Because they say, we think of all sorts of ideas. There's enormous variation in ideas, but only few ideas survive. And only the ones that are best adapted to their environment survive. And they say that this Darwinian selection process in the evolution of ideas also creates design without designer in ideas. And many people disagree because they say, well, obviously there's a difference because we design our ideas. But that may not be entirely true because sometimes we may introduce ideas that are only accidentally well adapted to their environment. We don't intend or recognize this as such. And if such ideas are cumulatively preserved, this creates the possibility of design without designer in the evolution of ideas. Okay, this is very theoretical, so now finally I'll go back to the witch hunts. Because I had this question. How is it possible that this concept of witchcraft was so well designed if it was not shrewdly designed by witch hunters? The possible answer could be that it was a process of Darwinian selection in the evolution of witch beliefs. Because people thought of all sorts of beliefs about witches, but only few survived. Most of them died out. Most of them did not become part of this cumulative concept of witchcraft. And this is also what we find in historical documents. So for instance, during an interrogation in the Swiss city of Basel, a young woman confessed that an old woman had seduced her into witchcraft by introducing her to 15 men in green clothes on the first floor of the house and said, if you become a witch, you may choose any one of them. But as we now know, this one did not survive well, this idea. It did not become part of the cumulative concept of witchcraft. And I think it's quite understandable that it didn't, because it's a bit complicated, it has some arbitrary details. One starts to wonder why 15, why green clothes, why the first floor? And it's also boring. Unlike the idea about initiation to witchcraft that did make it, namely intercourse with the devil. That one was far more shocking and perverse, and much better adapted to the fears of that particular time period. Another idea that didn't make it was a belief that appeared in Basque country in the early 17th century, and that was that witches have frogs, and that they regularly whip these frogs on their backs with a little whip. And again, I think it's quite understandable that this one didn't make it, because it may be perverse, but it's fairly innocent at the same time. I mean, people are not going to think like, oh my goodness, they're whipping frogs, we must stop this. It won't put people into action. And that's unlike some ideas about witchcraft that did make it, such as the belief that witches kill children. I mean, that potentially does put people into action. So beliefs like these did not have any significant effects that ensured their own survival, and therefore they disappeared, like the overwhelming majority of beliefs about witches. But sometimes ideas appeared that did have significant effects that ensured their own survival, such as the belief in the witch's Sabbath. As I explained, this belief strongly increased the reproduction of witch hunting, because people with this belief on their mind were far more likely to create big witch hunts, and also probably to tell others about the danger. So this idea survived together with the witch hunts it created. And if we look at historical documents, it seems unlikely that people who introduced and maintained this belief did so with the intention of increasing hunts for imaginary demons that did not benefit anyone. Yet still, that was the effect that made it survive. So this belief may have been only accidentally well adapted to make people hunt for witches. It may have been a chance hit, just like the belief in nightly flight, torture as a means of interrogation, or intercourse with the devil may have been chance hits. So what I believe has happened in the evolution of witch beliefs is the cumulative preservation of ideas that accidentally made people hunt for witches, thus creating a form of design without designer in the evolution of witch beliefs, a concept that was not designed, the concept of witchcraft. Okay, so this was the first question. I also had this other question. How is it possible that witch hunts survived for so long, despite the fact that nobody substantially benefited from them? Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett also have something interesting to say in this respect, because they say that because ideas undergo this process of Darwinian selection, they may sometimes start behaving like another product of Darwinian selection, viruses. And as they point out, viruses very often manipulate the behavior of their hosts to make the host do things that are not good for the host, but that are only good for the survival of the virus itself. So for instance, influenza, it makes us sneeze. But is sneezing good for us? No. But it's very good for the survival of influenza. Or rabies, the mad dog disease that makes dogs bite. Is it good for dogs? No, not at all. Actually, it's very dangerous for dogs. But it's very good for the survival of rabies. So viruses manipulate behavior. They have all sorts of tricks. And Dawkins and Dennett say that ideas may sometimes do the same thing. Ideas may also manipulate our behavior to make us do things that are not good for us, but that are only good for the survival of the ideas themselves. And they call it viruses of the mind. And I think that witch hunting may be a very good example of a virus of the mind. Because, for instance, think about torturing witches. Was it good for the people who were doing this? No, not at all. But it was very good for the reproduction of witch hunting. So the concept of witchcraft made people do things that were not good for themselves, but only good for the survival of the concept. The concept manipulated their behavior. So there seems to be a deeper similarity. It may have been a virus of the mind. And what is very intriguing in this respect is that historians have already quite often compared witch hunts to viruses, because there were sudden outbreaks of witch hunting, a form of contagion among a population, and many casualties as a result. But historians only use this comparison as a figure of speech. They didn't look for anything deeper. But I think there is something deeper going on, because both are the product of Darwinian selection processes. So historians have been looking for the beneficiaries of the witch hunts all over the place, but they could not find them. And probably this is because one potential beneficiary was all the time overlooked, namely the witch hunts themselves. So to conclude, I hope that you now all understand, at least a little bit, why I think that my two fascinations are related. Thank you for your attention.
thank you very much. Is this on? That was really fascinating and very well, eloquently explained, Caroline.
Okay,
I'm sure that there are questions from the audience. If there are, please raise your hand. Oh, loads.
Hi.
Hi.
Is this? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. This was really, really cool. I have a question. That I mean, you mentioned Dawkins and how I think he calls it the meme. That's the way it comes from, right? It's the meme theory and stuff. And there I read something, because I wrote my bachelor thesis ages ago on something similar with the memes and other people that took it further to explain things like this. So this is really cool. But I always feel that once you take it to that, to explain things like that, I always get this feeling of unease because you completely remove the agency from the people. And the people and the society become nothing but kind of the carrier of the meme, just like the host, the host of the idea, basically.
Yeah.
And all sorts of intentionality is completely removed. And don't you, because don't you run a risk of then overlooking agency and intentionality? Because if you think that theory through, there's no place for that at all. That's what I found always a bit frightening about this theory, that it's like you go with that and that's what it is then. There's no place for anything else. So it's a bit of a fundamentalist theory, isn't it?
Yes, I certainly think that is a danger. Because of course there is human agency. So I think agency and sort of selfish memes idea may just be complementary forms of explanations. But at some point people also find it frightening because we tend to believe that we create our culture and society. Nowadays many social scientists and scholars from the humanities always say that things are socially constructed. So we find it a bit frightening that we do not create it. But I think very often good scientific ideas make us less important. Copernicus said, we are not in the middle of the universe. And Darwin said, we are not the crown of the animal world. And Freud said, we don't rule our own mind. And Dawkins said, we're not the only ones who make our socio-cultural world. It's also a selection mechanism that sort of goes beyond us. And always people find this very frightening, but that does not mean that they are untrue.
There was a question here.
Okay, first I want to say that I think this was a really great talk.
Okay, thank you.
Really cool. But I still find it hard to believe that an idea, it's kind of related maybe to what he said, like has an agency in the sense that it wants to replicate itself.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't an alternative idea that this idea is not adapted well because it's just by accident, but it's because it plays into some fundamental weaknesses that we have as humans, some fundamental fears that we have, that like fear of your children dying, fear of your crop which you're dependent on, that it just happens to grasp onto those ideas, but it's not arbitrary in that sense. It's just happened to tap into those fears that we have, or we used to have.
I don't know if I completely understand your question, but of course it's a figure of speech if you say that ideas have intentions or want to replicate. Because of course I don't mean that ideas literally want this, just like viruses don't have any intentions. But they behave as if they are very smart, viruses. But they are not smart, it's just the ones that were accidentally good at reproducing, they reproduce. So I think you should look at it in this way, that ideas that accidentally reproduce well, they reproduce. And there's no need that we realize this or intended this as such. So it looks as if it has some sort of agency, but of course it's a figure of speech. I don't literally mean that it has an agency. I hope that I've sort of answered your question. Okay.
Maybe I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know it's a really interesting discussion, but we'll continue it in the break. I'll just take a couple more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I thought it was a really, really fascinating presentation that you gave. I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on this process of Darwinian selection, because you say some ideas just sort of take off and some don't. Mm-hmm. And as a social scientist, I kind of wonder what the causal mechanisms are there. And I wonder if you've looked in any way at how these ideas are being reproduced by, for example, media, or how they've traveled from city to city where you see an idea popping up first and being reproduced in other cities, and if you can sort of map out patterns like that. Because to me it sounds like, yes, you're linking two very interesting concepts, but I don't see the mechanism underlying what you call Darwinian selection.
There were witches flying on broomsticks, right? That transported you.
Well, of course, the concept of witchcraft spread because people were writing books about it, and all over Europe people were reading these books. So, of course, it's quite obvious how this concept spread. And, of course, there was the way witch hunts occurred always influenced what ideas were transmitted or not. So there was a constant mechanism, sort of ideas influence witch hunts influence ideas. And the ideas that made witch hunts bigger were probably more likely to be transmitted. I'm sorry? How do you mean the agency?
Well, again, I'm going to cut the discussion short. We'll take one more question from the DJ, and then we'll go into the quiz.
Again, brilliant presentation.
Okay, thank you.
I was just wondering, gets me started to think, what are other viruses of the mind? Because there are numerous viruses in the world, so there must be other viruses of the mind in history, examples, and you got me intrigued into some other, finding out some other examples of this concept. Do you have an idea?
Well, I'm a bit careful because I would have to look at the specific phenomenon to really say this. But Richard Dawkins himself mostly uses religion, but I think religion is an extremely diverse phenomenon that very often is functional for people in many ways. But some elements of religions do look like a virus of the mind. So, yeah, religions, the most successful religions in the world tell people that you should constantly convert others and that you may never have another religion. So that, of course, is very good for the reproduction of the religion itself. Or, well, for instance, the terror in Stalinist Russia. That may be some sort of virus of the mind, because nobody really benefited from this. Stalin didn't benefit from this, and no.
Thanks for your question. All right, let's move along. Thanks for your talk again. Tradition dictates that we give our speakers a comic, and I found a really appropriate one for today. It's called Hack and Slash, Friday the 31st. It's not a really nuanced comic, I think, but I hope you still enjoy it. Thanks again.